All right, another one here in the front of the book. I think this one I'm going to just read out the whole thing, so there's less uh, sort of subjectiveness about it, using some of the terms we've already talked about. This one uh, gets pretty bastardized and misused a lot, mostly by a bunch of angry people, whether or not, who feel certain injustices, whether or not they've had those injustices put on them or not. But a lot of times, there's some people who have a certain philosophical basis for it and an argument for it. But 9 times out of 10, if you hear someone using the word anarchy or anarchism, they're fairly ignorant of it. A lot of times people are just thinking that, oh, we'll just get rid of any sort of structure or whatever. And it's like, well, wait a minute. First of all, certain structures within society have developed, over course in time anyway, in indigenous populations, even ones that have not been contacted by the West. There's still certain hierarchical structures to it. But getting rid of everything means that nothing's going to stop me from doing what the heck I want to do to you. I had a whole argument with someone in government one time. I'm like, if there was complete anarchy right now, I could just sort of kill you and move on, and there'd be no consequences to it. And he sort of looked at me funny, and I looked at him because it was like, no, no, dude. Um, but maybe I spoke out of turn, but I was really tired of hearing a lot of just nonsense come out of people's mouths. And this is one of the reasons I do Tai Chi and meditate, because I've been able to chill out a little bit more. But the idea that this is really ill used has always sort of stuck with me, because there's a lot of people who claim they want this without understanding what it really means. They just think it's cool to say, kind of thumb their nose and say bad words at a system of authority, without understanding what that means. And there's a lot of these people that say that when they're 15, 16, and then turn out to be part of the authority later on anyway, or are 50, 60 years old and have never developed cognitively beyond being 13 to 15 years old, or maybe 70 years old too, if we're looking at people in government. But anarchism, is a political philosophy holding that government is unnecessary and harmful, and that the social organization can best be achieved through voluntary cooperation among individuals and groups. From the Greek, meaning no government, the term anarchy has become popularly and inaccurately, thank you, book, synonymous with confusion and lawlessness, implying that government is imperative to an ordered society. I'm going to repeat that. The term anarchy has become popularly and inaccurately synonymous with confusion and lawlessness, implying that government is imperative to an ordered society. So you got all these dystopian books and movies and TV shows and everything like that talking about anarchy. It is philosophically and politically inaccurate to think that just utter breakdown in every sort of way of structure, um, or orderliness to a group isn't going to happen. No, human beings are social animals. We need to be in groups. There's always going to be some sort of somewhat order or hierarchy to it, whether it's an equal council, if it's a small enough group, maybe a one-to-one vote, or some sort of figurehead or leader, or something can evolve out of that. Again, this is where human nature comes in, where sometimes now it's like, oh, they have stuff I want too, so things along those lines go up. But it's not just chaos. Anarchists, however, see authoritarian government as the tool of the powerful, propertied classes, and the enemy of just social order. So if you're a genuine anarchist, it's the government that enforces a certain set of rules that benefit now, a social class that's an elite social class, and that is what's creating disorder within your society. I'm not going to say civilization. That's a whole other conversation I'm not going to have right now. But with your society, the anarchist byword was coined by the founder of modern anarchism, Pierre Joseph Proudhon, in What is Property, 1840. Property is theft, was the quote from that. So anarchists criticize the state, so any sort of like government organization, primarily on the grounds that it serves itself and its powerful constituents at the expense of the mass of citizens, and that its legitimate functions could and should be performed at the local level, some of those things would be difficult if we're talking about a country that spans, a continent, which is where some, problems in terms of the United States or even Canada or something comes from, because we're so huge with so many different, even, ecosystems almost. We got desert, we've got, the Pacific Northwest, we've got deciduous forests, we've got plains, we got swampy stuff and everything, and then, different cultures. We've got 5 or 6 different, like, big cultures just in the continental United States alone. However, anarchists differ widely on the question of how a stateless society would actually work. The alternatives they envision range from individualism, with every person acting as an autonomous, self-governing entity, to collectivism, in which individual interests are subordinated to the needs of the whole. Virtually all anarchist formulas place considerable faith in human nature, skepticism about which is the principal source of criticism of anarchistic ideals. While anarchism is traditionally associated with radical revolutionary movements, the objections to strong government, bureaucratic power, compulsory taxation, and the like have much in common with modern libertarian and conservative ideologies. So again, it's kind of both sides of the middle or kind of start sounding kind of the same after a while in some things. There's a certain circle that gets made there. What voice did I almost fall into? There's an imitation I almost did there, and I can't think of what it is. Sorry. The anarchist reputation for violence and the cartoon image of the anarchist developed in 19th century Russian revolutionaries. Developed with 19th century Russian revolutionaries such as Mikhail Bakunin, who wished to overthrow the entire institutional, legal, and political structure of European governments and sought to initiate a general uprising with the dramatic acts of terrorism. In the United States, fears of violent anarchism were often exploited by civil authorities. In the 1886 bombing of Chicago's Haymarket Square, which killed several policemen, and in the Sacco and Vanzetti case in the 1920s, anarchists were convicted of crimes on scant evidence by anxious juries. So this, again, to me, would sort of play into that idealism of human nature, where some people, are going to take those sort of extrajudiciary means, and that creates feedback of violence and fear. An important related strand in anarchist history was syndicalism, or, in its more radical manifestations, anarcho-syndicalism, derived from militant French trade unionism. This movement declared that popular liberation could not be achieved by political means, but would come about only through direct action by the working class in strikes, sit-downs, and even sabotage. Widespread in Southern Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, syndicalism gained little following in the United States, where it was prominently represented by the industrial workers of the World Labor Union, whose members were called Wobblies. Wobblies. Sorry, it's just fun to say. Wobbly. Wobble. Another influential strand of anarchism developed in the early feminist movement, some of whose adherents responded strongly to the anarchist critique of traditional institutions and established authority. The foremost feminist anarchist was Emma Goldman, a Lithuanian immigrant who was radicalized by the Haymarket trials and by conditions in the corset factory where she worked. She became a tireless campaigner for political and social change, a champion of workers' and women's rights, and a scandalously outspoken advocate of birth control and, quote, free love. So, anarchy, at its base, is not just lawless, Walking Dead, Escape from New York, just sort of insane, chaotic sort of thing. It's talking about an over authoritarian overlay of structure that favors uh, a small proportion of its members at the expense of other people. So traditionally, anarchy is not going to be, it developed into then more violent sort of things as time went on, and those are going to get squashed. Those are going to get reacted to in violent ways as well. And then you might see a lot of the modern idea of memes and so on and so forth now. It was like, well, no revolution or anything happened in terms of without some sort of violent thing. But I would also like to point out that and some of the people also want to point out too was like, well, look what happened with the French Revolution. Well, let's look at what happened with the French Revolution. Quick history. Um, yes, the people were being horribly mistreated by the elite. They went in there and started what was called the Reign of Terror, where they murdered a bunch of people of those elite. They started running out of the elite, so they started being able to murder other people, including their own leaders, because they weren't revolutionary enough. After a few years, they started mandatory military conscription for people, and then a few years later, this hugely violent revolutionary movement turned into an actual military dictatorial imperialist power when Napoleon came to power. By the way, Napoleon was of average height for the time. The nickname Little General was because he was ambitious, and it came mostly when he was lower rankings in as an officer, and it was mostly because of his ambition. It had nothing to do with his height. He was probably about average height for the time and the place. So, these are things that have to be sort of thought of too. The critique of it has a sort of idealized view of human nature that if we strip out this overlayer of other things, then people will take care of themselves. And in some instances, we can see that. A few years ago when big parts of Japan were destroyed and everything like that from the tsunamis and earthquakes, and just people leaving like anonymous food in places. Even now, there are things on the news or news feeds or anything like that where people are checking on people if they have elderly neighbors or people who might be in the sort of high risk factors for being very affected by things in a way that is going to be sort of appropriate within the um, reasonable protective things that we're trying to do with that. So people will, on some instances, go out of the way with that. It might be on one end or another of the bell curve. On average, people might just sort of leave things alone. We do tend to sort of tribalize in certain things. Look at the way that people huddle around sports teams or school spirit for high schools or colleges or universities. In Cleveland, we have that whole thing. They're not really gangs; it is considered cliques, but even cliques or gangs or mobs or any of this other stuff. From what I understand, and I don't know how apocryphal this is, might be a little bit mythological, but some of like Italian mob stuff actually came as a way to sort of fight against really tyrannical sort of government, and then it sort of turned into something very different. But then people identify with that, and they identify very much with families, or they identify with it. People do tend to sort of group together, and so that's something to think about in with that too. So, but going back to the actual definition, Actual definition of anarchy, not just being a violent poopy head wanting to destroy things just to watch the world burn. That's not a true anarchist. Someone who's going to just violently destroy things because they want to violently destroy things and everything is just mentally ill. So some clarification on that. And good luck.